There comes a moment in life when you realize not everything needs your reaction and not everything deserves your attention. Peace is not something you find outside. It is something you protect inside. And the first step toward that protection is removal. Not loud removal, not dramatic exits, but quiet discipline. So, listen carefully. Removing the need for constant validation is one of the most powerful steps a person can take toward inner freedom, because as long as your sense of worth depends on the opinions, approval, or reactions of others, you are never truly living your own life. You are living a borrowed version of it, shaped by expectations, filtered through judgment, and controlled by external feedback. This creates a fragile identity that rises and falls with every comment, every like, every praise, and every criticism. When approval is present, you feel temporarily high, but when it is absent, you feel empty, uncertain, or even lost. This emotional dependency slowly weakens your inner stability and makes your peace conditional instead of permanent. A person who constantly seeks validation begins to lose touch with their own voice. They start asking, "What will people think?" before asking, "What do I think?" This shift is subtle at first, but over time, it becomes a habit of surrendering personal truth for social acceptance. Decisions are no longer made from clarity, but from fear of rejection. You begin to adjust your behavior to fit into environments, even when those environments do not align with your values. You start performing instead of living, presenting instead of existing, and slowly your identity becomes a reflection of others rather than an expression of yourself. The mind under validation, seeking pressure, becomes restless. It constantly monitors reactions, reads expressions, and overanalyzes responses. A single negative comment can overshadow 100 positive ones. This imbalance creates emotional instability where peace is easily disturbed. Even success becomes stressful because it must be confirmed by others to feel real. Without external approval, achievements feel incomplete, as if they do not belong to you unless someone else recognizes them. True strength begins when this dependency is quietly broken. It does not mean ignoring all feedback or becoming emotionally detached from everyone, but it means building an internal anchor that does not shake every time the outside world changes its tone. When you stop depending on constant validation, your actions become more authentic. You begin to speak without rehearsing for approval. You begin to make choices without seeking permission from invisible audiences in your mind. You begin to exist without performing. This shift also changes your emotional resilience. Criticism no longer destroys your confidence, and praise no longer controls your ego. You start seeing both as temporary signals, not definitions of who you are. This allows you to remain steady in situations where others become reactive. You no longer need to defend every opinion or justify every decision because your sense of self is no longer outsourced. Letting go of validation also creates space for self-trust. Instead of constantly asking for reassurance, you begin to rely on your own judgment. You learn through experience rather than approval. Mistakes no longer feel like identity failures, but like necessary steps in growth. You become more focused on progress than perception, more interested in truth than appearance. Over time, this quiet removal transforms the entire inner landscape. The need to be seen fades, and the need to be real becomes stronger. You start choosing depth over attention, clarity over approval, and peace over performance. And in that shift, something powerful happens. Life stops feeling like a stage where you must impress others and starts feeling like a space where you can finally breathe without watching yourself through someone else's eyes. Removing emotional overreaction is one of the deepest forms of inner discipline because most of human suffering does not come from events themselves, but from the intensity of reaction we attach to them. When the mind is untrained, it treats every situation as urgent, every comment as personal, and every challenge as a threat. This creates a life where emotions are constantly swinging between extremes, where peace is easily disrupted, and where small incidents feel larger than they truly are. Emotional overreaction is not just a habit. It becomes a pattern that shapes how a person experiences reality. When someone reacts instantly to everything, they lose control of their inner space. A single word can trigger anger, a small misunderstanding can create conflict, and a minor delay can lead to frustration. The mind becomes like a surface with no depth, where every external movement creates internal disturbance. In this state, the person is not responding consciously. They are being pushed by impulses. Each reaction drains energy, and over time, this creates exhaustion that is not physical, but emotional. Overreaction also distorts perception. A neutral situation can feel negative simply because the emotional state is unstable. This leads to misinterpretation of intentions, unnecessary arguments, and regret after impulsive responses. Many relationships are damaged not by major issues, but by uncontrolled reactions that escalate situations beyond their true size. The inability to pause creates a cycle where every emotional trigger becomes a potential conflict. But between stimulus and response, there is always a space. That space is where awareness exists. Most people never enter that space because they are conditioned to react immediately. They believe reacting quickly means being strong. But in reality, uncontrolled, clear-throat reaction is a sign of inner instability. True strength lies in the ability to pause, observe, and choose a response instead of being controlled by emotion. When a person begins to remove emotional overreaction, the first change they notice is silence within. The mind becomes less noisy because it is no longer jumping from one emotional peak to another. Situations that once felt overwhelming begin to feel manageable. The same external world remains, but the internal experience changes completely. This is because reaction is not about what happens outside, but about how deeply it is allowed to enter. Inside, this discipline requires awareness. It is not about suppressing emotions, but about understanding them before expressing them. Instead of immediately reacting, the mind learns to observe. What am I feeling and why? This simple shift creates distance between emotion and action. In that distance, clarity begins to form. What once felt like urgency now feels like a passing wave. As emotional overreaction decreases, relationships also begin to transform. Communication becomes calmer. Arguments lose intensity. Misunderstandings are handled with more patience. Instead of defending every point emotionally, the person learns to listen first. This reduces unnecessary conflict and creates space for understanding rather than escalation. Internally, this shift builds resilience. Life still brings challenges, disappointments, and unexpected changes, but the mind no longer collapses under them. It learns that not every situation requires immediate emotional investment. Some things resolve on their own when not amplified by reaction. This realization creates a sense of control that is not based on controlling events, but on controlling response over time. Emotional overreaction loses its power because awareness grows stronger than impulse. The mind begins to recognize patterns before they take control. Instead of being pulled into every emotional wave, a person learns to stay grounded like a still surface beneath moving water. And in that stillness, there is clarity, and in that clarity, there is peace that does not depend on external conditions, removing draining relationships. Silently has snorts is not about anger or revenge, and it is not about proving a point or creating conflict. It is about recognizing that not every connection in life is meant to grow with you, and not every person who stays close to you is adding value to your inner world. Some relationships continue out of habit, obligation, or emotional dependency, but deep within, they take more than they give. They slowly reduce your energy, disturb your focus, and pull your attention away from your own growth. The most dangerous part is that this drain often happens quietly, without obvious conflict, making it harder to notice until you feel mentally and emotionally exhausted. Draining relationships are not always loud or toxic in an obvious way. Sometimes they come in the form of constant negativity, repeated complaints, emotional snorts dependency, or subtle manipulation. You may notice that after certain conversations, your mind feels heavier, your motivation drops, or your peace disappears without a clear reason. This is not accidental. Energy exchange is real, and every interaction leaves an impact on your mental state. When you consistently interact with people who are emotionally unstable, overly demanding, or internally unbalanced, their patterns begin to affect your own inner stability. One of the strongest signs of a draining relationship is imbalance. You are always the listener, always the supporter, always the one adjusting, while your own needs remain unheard or ignored. Over time, this creates emotional fatigue. You start feeling responsible for other people's emotions while losing connection with your own. You begin to carry burdens that were never yours to carry, and slowly your inner peace becomes snort secondary to maintaining outer harmony. The challenge is that most draining relationships are not easy to leave. There may be emotional history, attachment, loyalty, or fear of being misunderstood. Because of this, many people stay longer than they should, hoping things will improve or feeling guilty for creating distance. But silence is often the most powerful form of protection. Not every separation needs explanation, and not every withdrawal needs justification. Sometimes, the most respectful way to protect yourself and others is to slowly reduce emotional involvement without creating unnecessary conflict. As you begin to distance yourself from draining influences, you may feel discomfort at first. The mind resists change because it is familiar with certain patterns, even if they are harmful. There may be guilt, doubt, or emotional confusion. But over time, clarity begins to replace confusion. You start realizing how much energy was being consumed in maintaining connections that were not aligned with your well-being. That energy now becomes available for your own growth, focus, and inner balance. Letting go silently also means you do not create drama around your decision. You do not announce it, argue about it, or seek approval for it. You simply begin to shift your attention. Responses become shorter, availability becomes limited, emotional engagement becomes minimal. This quiet withdrawal is often more effective than confrontation because it removes emotional fuel from the connection without unnecessary conflict. As space is created, your inner world begins to stabilize. Your thoughts become clearer, your emotions become lighter, and your attention returns to yourself. You start noticing how much peace was hidden beneath the noise of constant emotional exchange. The absence of draining interactions does not create emptiness. It creates room for self-reflection and growth. Over time, you begin to understand that protecting your energy is not selfishness, it is responsibility. Every person has a limited emotional capacity, and how you distribute it determines your quality of life. When you stop allowing others to consume more than they contribute, your inner strength increases naturally. You become more present, more focused, and more aligned with your own direction. This quiet removal is not about rejecting people, but about respecting your own boundaries. Trotro snorts Tosh, it is about choosing balance over chaos, clarity over confusion, and peace over emotional exhaustion until snorts your life becomes less about managing others' energies and Hess snorts more about protecting your own inner state. Removing overthinking the past is one of the most important steps toward mental freedom, because the past, once it is over, no longer exists in reality. Yet it continues to live in the mind of those who refuse to let it go. The mind has a tendency to replay old situations, revisit old mistakes, and relive old emotions as if they are still happening. This creates a loop where a person is physically in the present, but mentally trapped in a version of time that cannot be changed. The more attention is given to the past, the more power it gains over current emotions, decisions, and identity. Overthinking the past often begins with regret. A person thinks about what they should have done differently, what they could have said, or how things might have turned out if they had chosen another path. At first, this seems like reflection, but slowly it turns into mental repetition. The same memory is revisited again and again, each time with added emotional weight. Instead of learning from the experience and moving forward, the mind keeps reopening the same emotional wound. This prevents healing and keeps the inner state stuck in unresolved tension. Another form of past overthinking is guilt. Trosso snorts Tro, the mind continuously judges itself for actions taken or words spoken. Even when circumstances are no longer relevant, the emotional burden remains. This creates a distorted sense of self, where a person begins to identify with their mistakes instead of their growth. They forget that mistakes are events, not a snort's identities. But when overthinking takes control, the past becomes a label rather than a lesson. There is also a subtle attachment to nostalgia. The mind romanticizes past moments, believing that things were better before, that opportunities were lost, or that certain phases of life can never be repeated. While reflection can be natural, excessive attachment to what was creates dissatisfaction with what is. The present moment begins to feel incomplete because it is constantly compared to an idealized version of the past. This weakens appreciation for current life and reduces awareness of present opportunities. The most damaging effect of overthinking the past is that it steals mental energy. Every time the mind revisits something that cannot be changed, it drains focus from what can be changed. Attention is a limited resource, and when it is consumed by memories, it is no longer available for action, creativity, or decision-making. This creates a cycle where the more a person thinks about the past, the less they are able to build their future breaking. This cycle requires awareness. The first step is recognizing when the mind is not in the present moment. Most people do not realize they are overthinking the past until they feel emotional heaviness or mental fatigue. Once this awareness is developed, the next step is gently redirecting attention back to the present task, the present environment, or the present breath. This shift does not erase memories, but it reduces their control. It is also important to understand that the past cannot be corrected by thinking about it. No amount of mental replay can change what has already happened. The only thing that can change is the meaning assigned to it. A mistake can either remain a source of pain or become a source of understanding. The difference lies in how the mind chooses to interpret it. As overthinking reduces, mental space begins to open. Chalker snorts, chaw. The constant noise of repetition slowly fades and clarity starts to emerge. The present moment becomes more visible, more stable, and more meaningful. Instead of being mentally scattered across different timelines, attention begins to settle where life is actually happening. Decisions become clearer, emotions become lighter, and the mind feels less burdened by unnecessary weight. Over time, the grip of the past weakens naturally when it is no longer fed with attention. Memories remain, but they no longer control emotional state. The mind learns that peace does not come from rewriting history, but from accepting it and releasing its emotional hold, allowing life to move forward without resistance. Removing comparison with others is one of the most powerful shifts a person can make for inner peace, because comparison silently destroys self-worth while pretending to offer motivation. The mind naturally observes others, their success, their progress, their lifestyle, and their achievements. But when this observation turns into comparison, it becomes a source of inner conflict. Instead of focusing on personal growth, attention is constantly directed outward, measuring personal value against external standards that were never meant to define your journey. Comparison creates a distorted sense of reality. You only see fragments of other people's lives, not their struggles, not their failures, not their hidden doubts. Yet the mind compares your full reality with their highlighted moments. This imbalance creates unnecessary pressure. You begin to feel behind even when you are progressing. You begin to feel inadequate even when you are improving. This constant evaluation against others slowly weakens confidence and replaces self-trust with self-doubt. One of the most dangerous effects of comparison is that it shifts focus away from growth and toward competition. Instead of asking, "Am I improving compared to yesterday?" the mind starts asking, "Am I better than them?" This change in direction removes clarity. Life becomes a race that has no finish line because there will always be someone ahead, someone faster, someone more successful in a different area. This creates a cycle of dissatisfaction where achievement never feels enough. Comparison also steals presence. When the mind is occupied with others' progress, it is not fully engaged with its own path. Opportunities that are present in front of you begin to go unnoticed because attention is scattered. Instead of building your own foundation, energy is spent observing someone else's structure. This leads to delayed progress, not because of lack of ability, but because of lack of focus. Emotionally, comparison creates constant instability. One moment you may feel motivated by someone's success, and the next moment you may feel discouraged by your perceived lack of progress. This emotional fluctuation prevents stability and inner balance. Peace becomes dependent on external comparison rather than internal alignment. As a result, the mind is never settled, always moving between inspiration and frustration. Removing comparison requires a deep shift in awareness. It begins with recognizing that every individual has a different timeline, different circumstances, and different starting points. No two paths are identical, even if they appear similar from the outside. What you see in others is the result of their journey, not a measurement of your worth. Understanding this breaks the illusion that life is meant to be equal in timing or outcome. When comparison is removed, attention naturally returns to self-progress. Instead of measuring against others, you begin to measure against your past self. This shift is subtle but powerful. Growth becomes internal rather than external. Small improvements become meaningful because they are no longer overshadowed by someone else's achievements. Progress becomes personal, not competitive. This change also reduces mental pressure. There is no longer a need to constantly keep up, compete, or prove anything. The mind becomes more focused on consistency rather than comparison. Effort becomes more stable because it is no longer dependent on how others are performing. This creates a steady rhythm of growth that is not easily disrupted by external influence. Over time, a habit of comparison weakens as awareness strengthens. You begin to see success in others without feeling diminished by it. Their progress becomes separate from your identity. Instead of feeling threatened, you begin to feel neutral and sometimes even inspired without attachment. This emotional neutrality is a sign of inner stability. As comparison fades, a quiet confidence begins to grow. you start trusting your own pace, your own direction, and your own process. Life becomes less about measuring and more about experiencing. The mind becomes lighter because it is no longer constantly evaluating itself against external standards. And in that lightness there is space for clarity, focus, and a deeper sense of inner calm that does not depend on where others are standing in their journey. Removing excuses and the self-limiting identity is the final and most decisive step toward inner transformation, because excuses are not just words we say outwardly. They are patterns the mind uses to avoid responsibility and protect comfort. Over time, repeated excuses become a belief system, and that belief system turns into identity. A person stops saying, "I couldn't do it," and starts believing, "I am someone who cannot do it." This shift is subtle, but it quietly defines the limits of a person's actions. Decisions and potential excuses often begin as temporary justifications. When something is difficult, the mind looks for reasons to delay action or avoid discomfort. It says there is not enough time, not enough resources, not enough support, or not the right conditions. These thoughts feel reasonable in the moment, but when they are repeated consistently, they create a mental habit of avoidance. Instead of facing challenges directly, the mind learns to explain them away. This reduces short-term discomfort, but creates long-term stagnation. The problem with excuses is that they feel safe. Taking responsibility requires effort, discipline, and sometimes failure, but excuses protect the ego from all three. They create an illusion of control without real action. A person feels justified in not moving forward because there is always a reason, always a condition, always a situation that seems outside their control. Slowly, this pattern weakens discipline and strengthens dependency on external circumstances. As excuses accumulate, they begin to form a self-limiting identity. The mind starts labeling itself not disciplined enough, not strong enough, not capable enough, not lucky enough. These labels are not based on truth, but on repetition. The more they are repeated, the more real they feel. Eventually, the person no longer questions them. They become automatic thoughts that influence behavior without awareness. This identity becomes a barrier to growth because it defines what is possible before any attempt is made. Opportunities are avoided not because they are impossible, but because the mind has already decided failure in advance. This creates a life where potential remains unused not due to lack of ability, but due to lack of belief in that ability. The gap between what a person can do and what they actually do becomes wider. Over time, removing excuses requires honesty with oneself. It requires the willingness to see situations as they are without distortion or justification. Instead of saying, "I cannot," the mind begins to ask, "What can I do with what I have?" This small shift changes the entire direction of thinking. Responsibility replaces avoidance. Action replaces explanation. Clarity replaces confusion. Breaking the self-limiting identity also means questioning long-held beliefs about personal limits. Many of these beliefs were formed through past experiences, failures, or external influences, but they are not permanent truths. When they are challenged through action, they begin to weaken. Each small step taken despite resistance creates evidence against the old identity. Over time, this evidence becomes stronger than the belief itself. Discipline plays a key role in this transformation. When excuses arise, discipline acts as the bridge between intention and action. It allows movement even when motivation is low. This consistency gradually rewires the mind to respond with action instead of justification. The more this pattern is repeated, the weaker excuses become, and the stronger responsibility grows. As excuses fade, self-perception begins to change. A person who once saw themselves as limited starts to see themselves as capable of growth, not because circumstances changed instantly, but because behavior changed consistently. Identity, he snorts, is no longer shaped by what was avoided, but by what was faced over time. The habit of creating excuses loses its power because it is no longer reinforced. The mind begins to recognize that progress only exists where responsibility is accepted, and in that recognition, a new sense of inner strength begins to form. One that is based not on perfect conditions, but on the willingness to act regardless of conditions, slowly dissolving the limits that were once accepted as permanent reality. When all these layers are seen together, a clear truth begins to emerge. Inner peace is not something that arises from the outside, and it is not something that can be borrowed from circumstances, people, or success. It is built through removal, through awareness, and through quiet discipline. The noise of validation, emotional reaction, draining connections, past attachment, comparison, excuses, and self created limits all shape the inner world more than external events ever do. The real work is not in adding more to life, but in taking away what does not belong. Every toxic pattern released creates space, space for clarity, space for focus, space for stability. And in that space, a different kind of strength begins to grow, one that is not dependent on approval, reaction, or conditions. As these habits are removed, the mind becomes less reactive and more aware, less scattered and more centered, less dependent and more grounded. Life does not become free of challenges, but the inner response to those challenges changes completely. What once created disturbance no longer has the same control. In the end, peace is not a destination. It is a state maintained through continuous awareness, a quiet decision made again and again to let go of what disturbs balance and to remain aligned with what strengthens it.